Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. I went to the library the other day and I was browsing the bookshelves as usual, and I looked at the new acquisitions, and this is what I found. This great book by Miguel Ángel Asturias, Mr. President or El Señor Presidente. I did not know that this was about to be published again in a new translation. I had read the book many years ago in Spanish, of course, so let me show you the copy that I had. It's from Cátedra, which is usually the kind of edition that I like to go for because it has a lot of notes, introductions, and appendices and things like that. So anyway, Miguel Ángel Asturias is an underrated author in the context of Latin American letters. He was the second Latin American author to win the Nobel Prize in literature, after, of course, the great poet from Chile, Gabriela Mistral. So back in the day, when I was looking at the Nobel Prize winners, I had to make the decision, okay, what am I going to read by Miguel Ángel Asturias? And I basically looked at three options. Okay, I had Leyendas de Guatemala, Legends from Guatemala, which was his first book, El Señor Presidente, or Hombres de Maize, Men of Maize, were the three most important choices that I was faced with. And I decided to go with El Señor Presidente. So this was my first experience of Miguel Ángel Asturias' work. One of the reasons why I decided to do that, I'll be honest with you, is because my mother happened to have read this book, and I have her copy of Miguel Ángel Asturias' Obras Escogidas, this nice edition by Aguilar. I will show you in detail. I need to be careful with because this book is literally falling apart, and it later became the first volume of Miguel Ángel Asturias' Obras Completas, so it has really the early works by him. El Señor Presidente is Miguel Ángel Asturias' most famous novel, okay? And yet, in my humble opinion, I would say that this is not his masterpiece. So I wanted to say that from the beginning, but I also want to say that this is a very important novel because we are talking about the inaugurator, according to many people, of a very famous and very important genre in Latin American literature, unfortunately so. But what I'm talking about is, of course, the Dictator novel. So when I found that Miguel Ángel Asturias' El Señor Presidente had just been published again in an English translation, a new one, I was like, this is a perfect excuse for me to revisit this work, this time in English. I wanted to see how Asturias translated into English. So a little bit about the author. Okay, Miguel Ángel Asturias was born in Guatemala, and he became interested in his culture when he moved to Paris. So as a student, he began to study his country's indigenous cultures, which I think is very interesting. It happens to many of us, we become interested in our cultures, in our countries, when we leave them, you know what I mean? So that was definitely the case for me too. Now, Miguel Ángel Asturias was in Paris in the 1920s. So as you can imagine, one of the inevitable results of his being there at that time was the influence of Surrealism, an influence that was going to stay with him pretty much for the rest of his life. So this was a very important encounter for him that had huge impact on his art. He spent many years, much of his life, probably most of it abroad, in exile as a student, or even representing his country as a diplomat. So he lived outside of Guatemala for much of his life. He is known primarily for his novels, but initially he was a poet. If you look at this volume that I showed you from Aguilar, it has his poetry. And he also wrote some plays, but primarily he is a novelist. He received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1967. And if you're familiar with Latin American literature, you know what was happening in that context at that time, right? In the 60s, especially in the late 60s. Of course, the Latin American boom. So one of the things that the Swedish Academy was saying by awarding the Nobel Prize in Literature to Miguel Ángel Asturias was the boom did not just come out of nowhere. There had been a whole tradition before that influenced the boom. And Miguel Ángel Asturias was part of that tradition. Today you will hear that some people refer to him as part of the pre-boom, which is a label that I don't really like. Many critics speak of course, the Latin American boom, then the pre-boom and the post-boom, as if the Latin American boom were the only thing that matters in Latin American literature. So I don't really like the label. But, you could say that Miguel Ángel Asturias is definitely a precursor of the Latin American boom. Like who else? like Juan Rulfo, like Alejo Carpentier, like Juan Carlos Onetti, like Arturo Uslar Pietri, and many other authors, right? So they were part of that movement that came before. If you ask me, from all of those authors, he is most similar to Alejo Carpentier, whom he also greatly influenced, okay? As you may know, Alejo Carpentier is famous for the theory of lo real maravilloso, the marvelous real, which predates magic realism. It's very similar to it, but not exactly the same thing. And what is this, right? What is lo real maravilloso? Because Miguel Ángel Asturias did have something to do with that. As Alejo Carpentier himself would say, he saw, for instance, when you look at something like Surrealism, right, that was very important for all of these authors. Surrealism tries to achieve an aesthetic effect, right? It points to an aesthetic quality. Lo real maravilloso, and maybe by extension also magic realism, points to an ontological quality. In other words, Surrealism is just about trying to achieve an aesthetic effect. With Lo Real Maravilloso, what these authors are saying is basically that Latin America is inherently marvelous. It is marvelous by her very nature. So that is the kind of difference that we are looking at here. Asturias, he does not just write about the indigenous cultures of his country. He writes from their very perspective. So what you get is not really a description of that reality, but you get the very worldview, the cosmovisión, as we say in Spanish, the vision or the view of the cosmos from that perspective directly. So that is one of the many things about him that are amazing. Now I wanted to share something with you that Asturias said about his becoming a writer, okay? And this is an excerpt from a very important book titled Los Nuestros by the Chilean author Luis Hars. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the Spanish to you, and I'm going to have the translation on the screen so that you can follow it in case you do not understand Spanish. But this is something that Asturias said. He said, "Yo veo mi obra como una experiencia que emprendí sin ninguna intención literaria explícita o exclusiva, sino más bien como lo que se podría llamar un mandato del destino. Yo no quería ser un escritor, no decidí serlo. He tratado de encontrar un modo de expresar las cosas que sentí. Creo que mi experiencia será útil para otros que quieran trabajar con los primitivos elementos indios de nuestro mundo, con aspectos de la vida popular, usándolos en dosis moderadas, como he hecho yo, sin caer en los excesos del criollismo o por otra parte conformarse con el cosmopolitismo. Durante los años que pasé en París vi el ejemplo de muchos escritores cosmopolitas que escribían sobre París, sobre Versalles. Desde entonces sentí que era mi vocación y mi deber escribir sobre América, que algún día interesaría al mundo. Creo que en el futuro otros novelistas y poetas encontrarán otras maneras más lúcidas, eficaces y elocuentes de hacer lo que yo he hecho. Creo que para todos nosotros escribir es una cuestión de pasar por cierto tipo de experiencia. Entre los indios existe una creencia en el gran lengua. El gran lengua es el vocero de la tribu, y en cierto modo eso es lo que yo he sido, el vocero de mi tribu. So I really like this idea of the great tongue, the spokesperson, the spokesman or woman of the tribe. That is the way that Asturias saw himself. And I think it was very interesting that he says that he did not go out of his way to become a writer. That is something that sort of happened, by the mandate of destiny, as he says. So let's look a little bit at El Señor Presidente. Okay, this is considered to be the first Dictator novel, so it inaugurates that genre. I really like the fact that we have a kind of a mask here in this cover, and that, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but here we have the same thing, Interesting because, as you may know, mask, the word persona, means mask, right, by etymology. And that is exactly, it's one of the salient things when we talk about dictators. A dictator is a persona, right? So I thought it was very nice that they did that in the covers, maybe not even realizing it, or maybe they did, I'm not sure about that. So if we have a dictator novel, right, the inaugurator of the genre, it just begs to be compared to other novels of that type, right? Like Yo el Supremo by Augusto Roa Bastos from 1974. Also from 1974, El Recurso del Método by Alejo Carpentier. The next year, of course, you have my personal favorite when it comes to dictator novels, and I think I'm going to say this. I believe García Márquez's masterpiece, El Otoño del Patriarca. And then finally, you have a later text, a later Dictator novel, which is, of course, Mario Vargas Llosa's La Fiesta del Chivo from the year 2000. El Señor Presidente is, among other things, a condemnation of the presidency of Manuel Estrada Cabrera, who ruled Guatemala from 1898 to 1920. Even though this president is not mentioned in the text, it's kind of obvious that the reference is to him and his presidency. It was first published in Mexico, okay, in the year 1946, and then in a revised edition the following year in Buenos Aires in 1947. However, the genesis of El Señor Presidente was a short story titled Los Mendigos Políticos, which Miguel Ángel Asturias began to write in December of 1922. So my friend, you know what that means, right? That this video that you're watching is basically a kind of centennial tribute to at least that beginning of El Señor Presidente. So looking at contents and structure, right? The novel is divided into 3 parts in all of these editions, and it includes an epilogue, right? So you have 3 parts, an epilogue, and a total of, let's see if my Roman numerals are okay, 41 chapters, right? So that is what we have here. And at first, as you begin to read the novel, it might seem to you that the structure is a little bit loose, that like it's a little bit episodic, okay, almost episodic. But as you keep reading, you're going to realize that there is a protagonist here. The beginning of the novel is a very famous passage by this time. It begins alumbra, lumbre de alumbre, luzbel de piedra lumbre, and you keep repeating those sounds, right? And at first, of course, the first time you read this, even in Spanish, you're like, what the heck, like what is this? It's supposed to mimic the sound of bells. It has become a famous opening, one of those famous first lines in literature. And the novel opens with beggars in a public square insulting each other, just fighting, cursing each other and all that. So from the very beginning, you have the theme of dehumanization, right? The theme of degradation is very clearly established from the very first point. And right there, in that first chapter, you get the catalyst for the whole action of the novel, which is this event. Pelele, a beggar who is described as a dimwit initially, accidentally kills a colonel. Okay, this happens completely by accident. He does not know really what he is doing. This person is not really in his right mind. So the beggars are taken to prison, brutally tortured. One of them, is missing. He has no legs. He's blind, and they kill him. It's just really brutal. And they are, questioned, tortured, and they are forced to name a general, General Eusebio Canales, as the person who killed this other colonel. Eusebio Canales happens to be, of course, the opponent of the president. So from the very beginning, you have this idea that they already know who to blame because they want to get this guy out of the way, and this is the perfect excuse for them. So as I said before, as you continue to read, you're going to realize that there is one character that emerges or takes on the qualities of a protagonist, and that is Angel Face, okay? This is a Dictator novel, but it is also a love story. There are many threads here that are coming together, as you will see. Angel Face is the president's henchman, and his job is to take care of General Eusebio Canales. But there's a little thing that happens here. Angel Face falls in love with the general's daughter, Camila. Okay, so that's where you have the love story. And most of the novel, what it's going to do is it's going to follow this narrative thread that basically shows you the consequences of the conflict between love and duty. That is one of the huge themes here in El Señor Presidente. There is also another frame to consider, which is that of prison literature. So you can also consider, because of that theme, a comparison between El Señor Presidente and, I don't know, Dostoevsky's The House of the Dead, the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, like, of course, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and many other works of that nature. Now, I wanted to highlight 4 chapters for you that deal with 4 important threads from the novel. The first one has to do with prison literature. And for this one, you want to look at chapter 16, which is titled In the Casa Nueva Prison. Okay, this is a devastating chapter. It's really one of those places of the novel that are very, very difficult to read, because it details the interrogation and the physical and psychological torture of a character named Fedina. So it's really difficult to read. I wanted to show you a little thing that happens here. For instance, at one point she hears a song, right? And we get this description right after. The song rubbed little glass splinters into her flesh, as if to abrade her feminine modesty. You can see or hear the influence of surrealism right there, right? It's a very cruel description. It's striking. So that's what we mean when we say that surrealism influenced Asturias for the rest of his life. And then you also have something that, could help you to compare this with Dostoevsky, for instance, the one that I mentioned before. Listen to this description. The first night in a dungeon is terrifying. The prisoner is severed from life, cast into a dark, nightmarish world. Walls fade, ceilings vanish, floors disappear, and yet there's no sense of freedom. One feels completely dead. So you can see, the house of the dead, that kind of thing going on here. So that's why I mentioned prison literature. There's another key element here, of course, that is surrealism. Okay, and for this one chapter that might give you at least a sample of what Miguel Ángel Asturias' brand of surrealism is like, would be a chapter that tells you briefly about Angel Face trying to sleep. The title of this chapter is Going in Circles, and this is chapter 21. Okay, it deals with dreams, because we are in that middle state, between sleep and lucidity. And you get a description like this one, for instance. Let me see if I can find it. This should be page 138. Here we go. The god of sleep that piles the dark seas of reality took Miguel on board one of his many boats. Invisible hands pulled him out from the gaping jaws of events, the hungry seas that fought violently over their victims' parts. Okay, so that would be a little sample of the kind of surrealist writing that you can find in El Señor Presidente. And then, as we said before, this is also a love story, so you do want to look at that element there. And there's a chapter, which is chapter 35, titled Song of Songs, like that book in the Bible, right? This details a party at the president's house, or the president's country residence. It's not really his house, but the country residence, where Angel Face and Camila are present. They cannot avoid going there. And listen to this description, right? They're in love, right? They're together. But it says, serpents studied the situation. If fate hadn't brought them together, would they have found happiness? The destruction of the useless, enchanting paradise was brought to public auction in the infernal world. Spying shadows and the vague voice of doubt sprouted from the damp vacuum of guilt, while the calendar spun cobwebs in the corners of time. So, I mean, it's just that beautiful prose, that is Miguel Ángel Asturias for you. It's just it's because of that wonderful mix of elements that make up his style. This is the kind of thing that happens. And then a final element that I haven't mentioned before in detail, that is also very important, is the issue of myth. Okay, you have a chapter like chapter 37, which is titled Toil's Dance. Okay, now my edition, if you look at the Spanish one, this edition of El Señor Presidente comes with an appendix by Miguel Ángel Asturias himself, a text that has become famous now, that is titled El Señor Presidente como mito. Okay, Mr. President as myth. And what Miguel Ángel Asturias does in this text is to parallel the president, right, with the Maya Quiche god known as Toil, who demanded human sacrifices. And Asturias asks, isn't that what dictators do, to demand human sacrifices, to demand blood? So this is El Señor Presidente. He is an incarnation, in a way, of the Maya Quiche god Toil. Okay, Freud would have loved this, because you see what he's doing here, right? He's drawing a parallel, or looking at the permanence of myth in contemporary society, in contemporary history. So that is one of the points in which you can see the presence of myth. Of course, it's present in other works by Asturias, like Leyendas de Guatemala, very obviously. In Hombres de Maize, it's there too, definitely. But even in a novel like this one, you can also see that. Let me tell you a little bit about the translation. Okay, now I want to say this. There was a previous translation of El Señor Presidente that was actually titled El Señor Presidente. So it bore the same title as the Spanish novel. I have not read it. Okay, so I will say that this is my only experience of El Señor Presidente in English. This is a translation by David Unger, whom you probably know. He is a novelist. He was born in Guatemala. He lives in New York, teaches creative writing. So we have a very accomplished author here. And in the introduction, you know how it is. Usually when you get a translation, the translator talks a little bit about his or her approach to translation. And what Unger says, he says, bilingual readers may feel that I have not duplicated all the linguistic and narrative registers of the original, but I hope my translation comes across stereophonically, capturing much of the fire and novelty of the original. And I would say in that sense, he has been very, very successful. Now, when he says he did not duplicate the original, this is true. Okay, if you read Spanish and you read the texts back to back, the original and the translation, you will see that there are a lot of differences. This is acceptable. All translators do this one way or another. I have also found a few inaccuracies in the translation. You know, I have to say that. I will give you a quick example here, just so you know what kind of thing we're dealing with. So if you go to page 134 of the English translation, it says, a wholesome, restorative sleep that enters through the mirrors of the eyes and leaves through nostrils. This is what he desired. And if you go to the original version of that, what you find is un sueño de una pieza reparador, sin visitas que entran por los espejos y se van por las ventanas de la nariz. Algo así anhelaba. So in the original text is without those visits, you know, those visits that enter through the mirrors and all of that. Whereas in the English translation, you have that, you know, those things as a positive thing. So the meaning is altered. But what I mean to say is this, you know, even though we have inaccuracies like that one, there are a few others too. Those are details, okay? There really are details. If you read the entire text, it is a beautiful translation. It's very, you know, easy to read in English, even though Asturias is a difficult author. So I would say that, you know, this really is an excellent translation that reads beautifully in the target language. And one thing that you have to consider when it comes to Asturias is that he is considered to be one of the most difficult, quote unquote, Latin American authors, even to native readers of Spanish. I can tell you, El Señor Presidente, when I read it in Spanish, it wasn't not an easy read for me. And even more difficult was Hombres de Maize. That is a notoriously difficult text. So we are talking about a very complex type of discourse here. So further reading, okay, let me tell you a little bit about this, which basically what I want to do now is to put El Señor Presidente in the context of Asturias's body of work. El Señor Presidente is Asturias's second book. Okay, his first one, so before El Señor Presidente, from the year 1930, we have Leyendas de Guatemala. Okay, so a book that is quite specifically about legends. Okay, so it can be compared to Ricardo Palma's Tradiciones Peruanas, okay, a classic from 1872, and also to some texts that came after that, like Gabriel García Márquez's famous Big Mama's Funeral. Okay, so Los Funerales de la Mama Grande, that deals with myth. So before and after, you have very important texts that are in a similar vein to Leyendas de Guatemala. And right after the publication of El Señor Presidente, in the year 1949, it was that Asturias published Hombres de Maize. And if you ask me, that is his masterpiece. Okay, it is a very difficult read, but it is also just an amazing text. It's an amazing novel that has, you know, nothing to do with the traditional structures of the novel. You know, it's a very interesting text. So really, if it is difficult, you know, the difficulty of reading it really pays off. It is a book about many things, but it is about transformation. It is about metamorphosis, about Nahualism, right? So you could compare it to El Reino de este Mundo by Alejo Carpentier. You know that famous scene where Macandal becomes a mosquito depending on, or dies, depending on how you look at it. You know, you have those two perspectives. Great example of Lo Real Maravilloso, by the way. Hombres de Maize is like that. So it's really a very interesting novel. To differentiate it from El Señor Presidente, El Señor Presidente is a political novel. Hombres de Maize is a social novel. So that is the difference between the two. And the main theme that you will find in that other novel is basically the struggle of Latin America. So it's really worth your time if you want to read Asturias at his best. But El Señor Presidente is also a very important novel. So I would recommend, that you start with El Señor Presidente, and then that you move on to the Legends of Guatemala or Hombres de Maíz. And then, of course, after that, some years later, you have his Trilogía Bananera, the Banana Trilogy, which is, a very good series of novels about U.S. involvement in Latin America. So it's 3 novels, El Viento Fuerte, El Papa Verde, and Los Ojos de los Enterrados, which deal with that topic. Things like the involvement of the United Fruit Company and those things in Latin America. So, bottom line, because this video turned out to be a little bit longer than I expected, I was really happy to revisit El Señor Presidente, this time in English. It was like the perfect excuse for me to do that. I believe that you should read it, and that we have a very good translation here to approach and to maybe enter the world of Miguel Ángel Asturias. Miguel Ángel Asturias is just incredibly underrated, unfairly underrated, because he is considered to be difficult. I just feel that this is tremendously unfair. Just because an author happens to be difficult, quote unquote, what does that mean? Most of the time what it means is that he or she is working with structures that other authors do not explore. So, it's a great reason to actually read authors who are considered to be difficult. He is an author who just broadens your horizons and just invites you to look at the world from a different perspective. So that is enough reason for me to give this author a chance and to explore his work. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations? Just let me know. Thank you so much for stopping by. Have a wonderful day.